Eagle fans, it's EaglefanKarl. This is going to be the second in my series of videos that I'm doing, taking a look at the team position by position as we head into the 2017 offseason. If you missed it last week, I looked at quarterbacks and running backs. I'll go ahead and put a link up in the top corner there if you want to go ahead and click on that if you missed last week's video. This week, though, we're going to be taking a look at wide receivers and tight ends. And here's an interesting trivia question I have about the team for the 2016 season. Of all the players on the Eagles roster, who do you think led the team in receptions, yards, and receiving touchdowns this year? I'll give you a second to think about that. And think about all the options you've got, because when you really think about it, it's not that many that could have potentially done this. And the answer is Zach Ertz, of all people. And think about it, he missed 2 games towards early in the season because of an injury. So really, he only played 14 games, and yet he had more receptions and yards than a lot of the other guys on the team. So we'll be going through these guys individual by individual to take a look sort of at the whole picture. But I think that says a lot about the team when you've got a tight end who missed 2 games, and he led the team in receptions, yards, and touchdowns, at least receiving touchdowns. So that's sort of what we're looking at as we head into that. So let's go ahead and take a look at the roster as it relates to wide receivers and tight ends.
And first up is going to be Jordan Matthews. And when you look at Jordan Matthews, he's been a good receiver, I think. And I think he's been, for the most part, fairly decent. But the problem you've got with Jordan Matthews is he is not a number 1 wide receiver. And that's where the Eagles have essentially had to play him as because of the rest of the receiving core and how poor it is. But if you look at his stats for this year, it's not bad. 73 receptions for 804 yards and 3 touchdowns. Obviously, you'd wish the touchdowns were a little higher. But for the most part, he's a solid number, probably 2 or 3 receiver, but he's not a top receiver. And that's been the biggest problem with him, is that basically we've had to treat him as such. So I fully expect that he'll come back. I've got no knocks against him. So for those reasons, I would expect that Jordan Matthews is going to come back next year and continue to serve as one of our probably 2 starting wide receivers, because I don't think we're going to be able to overhaul the wide receiving core completely in 1 year. Next up is public enemy number 1, and that's Nelson Agholor. And, really what can you say about him? There's a lot of people that are down on him, that are calling for him to be cut, and I can see why. 36 receptions for 365 yards and 2 touchdowns is not good enough for a guy who was drafted in the first round. And the statistic that's really problematic, which I was too afraid to look up, was the number of drops he had this season, because so many times where he just should have held onto a ball that he just did not get. And that is really a problem when you're looking at a guy like Nelson Agholor, that the skills that he has, he needs to be doing a lot better than what he has done. And there's a lot of people, like I said, that have been calling for him to be cut. Hey, I was calling for him mid-season to be cut because I just thought he was such a drag on the team, and it was so problematic. But I hate to say it, when you look at him and his cap number, you just can't cut him. That's because if you keep him on the team this year, he's going to cost you $2.5 million in salary, and that's what will count against the cap. If you cut him, you'll actually have to pay more against the cap. $4.6 million is what you'd end up having to pay against the cap if you decided that you were going to go ahead and cut him. But so it's for that reason that you just really cannot cut this guy. And, I think he just needs to really take a look inside during this offseason and try and figure out, what went wrong and what can be salvaged. And I'm hoping that next year, if the Eagles do get another wide receiver somewhere, either in free agency or in the draft, that maybe it'll take some of the pressure off him, and he's not going to have to be the guy that is expected to do a lot. And if the expectations are lower for him, maybe he can succeed. Because of the numbers, you just can't cut him. And I think we're going to be stuck with him. We've got to have wide receivers on the team anyway. We can't go ahead and bring in, 4 new receivers and have 4 new receivers with Jordan Matthews. We're going to have to keep some of the guys we have this year. And because of the cap number, Nelson Agholor is the one that makes the most sense to keep. That brings up Green-Beckham, who's sort of our 3rd wide receiver. Here's the real scary thing. When I was talking about Nelson Agholor statistics, Green-Beckham's statistics are basically identical to Nelson Agholor's. 36 receptions, same number of receptions for 392 yards. So he had about 30 yards more receiving, and they both had 2 touchdowns. So when you look at the statistics between Nelson Agholor and Dorial Green-Beckham, they are virtually identical. And what's really problematic with that is Dorial Green-Beckham we didn't acquire until late August. So he didn't have the whole offseason to be learning the offense and all that kind of stuff. Now, all that said, he's really shown some issues where I think that I wouldn't want to put stock in him as a answer at wide receiver. I think he could be part of a package where we'd have, in terms of a 4 or 5 wide receiver group, that you would want to use him. And for those reasons, I think he could be useful. But for the most part, he's not going to be a guy that I'd want to have as my number 1 or number 2 wide receiver. I think, especially given his height, he makes sense in the red zone. And I think the Eagles underutilized him there this year. And I would go ahead and try and use him more in those kind of situations. So that's what I really think about Dorial Green-Beckham. I'd keep him on the team. He doesn't cost you much as far as the cap is concerned. Those reasons, I would just go ahead and keep him. Next up is Bryce Treggs, who ended up being sort of the guy that got promoted after Josh Huff had his issues and got cut from the team. And in looking for pictures for him, there's really only one game you can find pictures for him because there's probably really only one game that he did anything in. He had 3 receptions all year for 80 yards, and over half of those, matter of fact, almost 3/4 of those yards happened on this one play against the Giants. So, I would have thought they would have tried to use him more because he could potentially stretch the field. The Eagles really don't have a deep threat. I think that's something that's got to get addressed, and I see Bryce Treggs as being a guy who probably will not be around next year, and I'd be okay with that. The next guy we can talk about is Paul Turner, who obviously had his big contribution in the preseason, and he was the best receiver during the preseason, earned a spot on the practice squad as a result. Ended up having more catches and yardage than Bryce Treggs did. He had 9 receptions for 126 yards, but it took him a while to see playing time, and when he did, it was very limited. Given his height and the fact that he really can't do much on special teams except for potentially return kicks, I would expect that he is probably not going to be back next year. I really like Paul Turner. I wish they would have given him more of a shot, but I think that given the fact of how much overhauling we have to do in the receiving core, keeping another project around just isn't something that we're going to have a luxury of doing. So I wouldn't expect Paul Turner to be around next year either. That brings us to the tight ends, and I'll start with the old man first, even though Zach Ertz is probably the first string tight end. But Brent Celek obviously has been around the longest, but his production has dropped way off. He only had 14 receptions for 155 yards this year, no touchdowns. And really had sort of a down season. He's obviously on the bottom end of his career. But I really like Brent Celek, and because of the numbers, I think he's a candidate to come back next year. That's because he's due $5 million next year in salary. But if you released him, he would result in a $4 million cap hit. So it's sort of the same thing as you had with Chase Daniel when I talked about last week, that if you're going to cut him, you're only going to save $1 million on the cap. You're probably going to have to spend at least that much signing some sort of a tight end anyway. So for that reason, I think he's probably a guy that you end up keeping around for one more year. And I'm okay with that, especially given the other 2 tight ends that we could potentially have on the team. That brings us to Mr. December, Zach Ertz, who always seems to show up at the end of the season to get a lot of stats, to make his statistics look a lot better. And like I said, he led the team in receptions, yards, and touchdowns, or receiving touchdowns. He had 78 receptions for 816 yards and 4 touchdowns. All in all, Zach Ertz, I think, really has the potential to become someone. He missed those 2 games early in the season because of injury. I don't know if there's maybe some lasting effects as a result of those. That maybe it took him a little while to get going again, because he started off well against this game against the Browns, but then sort of had a drop off after the injury. And ultimately, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with him now that he'll have a full off season working with Carson Wentz, because that's another thing. Remember, with all these wide receivers, none of them really worked with him in the off season because everyone thought Bradford was going to be the starter. So it'll be interesting to see if they start to develop a little more of a chemistry like they did towards the end of the year, and he's able to build off of that. Because I think Zach Ertz could be a really good tight end, even a Pro Bowl level tight end. if he can put a full season together. But that's been always his issue, is putting a full season together. So I'd really like to see if he could start off strong and continue strong through the whole year, because I think that would be really important for Carson Wentz. And if we can get an over-the-top threat at wide receiver, I think it ultimately really helps Zach Ertz and the other tight ends as well. So for those reasons, Zach Ertz, he's our top tight end. I see no reason why he shouldn't be again next year. And hopefully, like I said, him and Carson can continue to build some chemistry as they continue on in their careers. And that brings us to the last guy, who's Trey Burton, who actually outperformed Brent Celek when you look at the statistics. He had 37 receptions for 327 yards and 1 touchdown. But the issue you've got with Trey Burton, and I clearly would like to bring him back, but he is a free agent. His contract is up. Now, the Eagles could make him a restricted free agent if they would tender him an offer. So that's going to be something to look at over leading up to free agency, is whether or not they tender him a contract offer or not. I hope they do. I'd like to see him stick around. I really think that he ended up being one of our more unsung heroes throughout the season. And for those reasons, I would really like to see them bring him back. I think if that's the case, we've got a really good trio of tight ends and guys that I'd like to see continue on the team, because those are the guys that I think that we could really build off of, because the tight ends are strong, the wide receivers are weak, and if we can fix the wide receivers, I think that makes the tight ends all that much better. So for those reasons, I'd really like to see him bring Trey Burton back. So I would stick with all 3 tight ends that we had this past season and bring them back again, and really just look to improve the wide receiving core.
So anyway, those are my thoughts on the receivers that we have. Obviously, a lot of work needs to be done in the offseason to upgrade this position. As we get into free agency, and especially the draft, that's something I'm going to be looking at. I know it's a long shot, but I'm really hoping that maybe Mike Williams falls to us in the first round, because I think that would be fantastic for Carson Wentz to actually have a legitimate weapon, and I think he's going to be a really good receiver. So at any rate, though, we'll tackle that when we come to it. Now, of course, we are going into the conference championship game weekend, so let's go ahead and take a look at the conference championship matchups. Someone asked me right before the playoffs started who I thought was going to make the Super Bowl. I'm going to stick with the 2 teams I said then. I'm going to say them again now, and that's the Packers and Patriots. I don't see either of those teams losing. Both of those teams are playing real well right now, and both of them have premier quarterbacks. When push comes to shove, I'll always take the team that's got the more proven quarterback in their roster, and that's certainly the case with the Packers over the Falcons and the Patriots over the Steelers. Although Ben Roethlisberger has been decent, Tom Brady obviously has a much larger pedigree than Roethlisberger does. So in terms of the games themselves, my predictions for the scores, I'm going to take the Packers to beat the Falcons 37-31. And then I'm going to go ahead and take the Patriots to beat the Steelers 28-17. So those are my predictions for the games. Let me know in the comments below if you think it's going to turn out differently, if we're going to have someone other than the Patriots playing in the Super Bowl for the conference championships. I'll be rooting for the Steelers, just so you know. But I just think that the Patriots will end up winning the game. So that's sort of my thoughts. Go ahead, like I said, leave your comment below. Let me know what you think, who's going to win, who you're rooting for. And then also, if you have a comment about the wide receivers or tight ends and think that maybe some of these guys could actually perform a lot better, or do we need to scrap them all and take the hit on Nelson Agholor, even if it means losing cap space? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll go ahead and check in next week. We'll be looking at the offensive line. Until then, fly Eagles fly.